Hello and welcome to Chillers and Thrillers, the paranormal podcast where I read true stories of people's encounters with the strange, unexplained, and creepy. No comedy, no skepticism, and no gore. Just 100% true spooky stories. Tonight is our Halloween special. 1 hour of true stories of people's supernatural encounters in the great outdoors. Halloween is my favorite time of year, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, so hopefully this episode will be spooky enough for all of us who love Halloween and all things scary. If you're interested in listening to other paranormal style podcasts, I recommend you give Adam Walker's The Veiled Chronicles a listen as well. The Veiled Chronicles is a weekly podcast where Adam delves into the mystifying realms that lay beyond our veil. Now, let's move on to our stories. Get your treats ready, turn down the lights, get cozy, and get ready to be scared. The Shack, submitted by user divine_interfac. This happened in April of 2006, towards the end of my junior year of college. My friend Travis dropped out of school at the beginning of the year to work for his dad, who owned a boutique construction company that specialized in historical renovations. It was a cool job, and Travis made good money, enough to buy a then top-of-the-line DSLR, which he brought everywhere. At some point, we started going on regular photo-taking excursions, he with his new digital camera, and me with my old 35mm Minolta. For a while, we just cruised in and around the outskirts of our Midwestern college town, looking for weird things to document, which there were a lot of, since the town has a pretty hippy-dippy countercultural history. One afternoon, we drove about an hour outside of town to a village that had nothing more than a long street with a few houses, a post office, a bar, and an abandoned storefront full of rusty heating and cooling equipment. We got out of the car and poked around, but nothing really caught our eye, so we packed up and left, taking the long way back home. We were about 15 minutes from the village when we passed an expansive and relatively unremarkable clearing in the woods. However, it was magic hour, and the hazy golden sunlight was hitting the clearing in the most beautiful, breathtaking way. So we pulled over and got out to take some pictures. We only managed to get a few shots off before the sun dipped behind the trees. We had just dropped our cameras off in the car when Travis spontaneously started heading towards the woods to our right. I asked what he was doing, and he said, "I need to check it out over there." So I followed him. An acute dissociative sensation, almost as if being on autopilot, came over me. We kept walking and eventually entered the woods. We didn't get too far before we saw it. A tiny wooden shack, door ajar, with a broken window, about 100 or so feet ahead of us. We continued without thought and got closer to the shack. It's difficult to describe what happened next, but a feeling of absolute, utter dread penetrated my entire being. My vision blurred, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. We both stopped and stood there, almost as if paralyzed, for I don't know how long. It could have been 10 seconds, it could have been 10 minutes. Then, a solitary thought came into my head. Run! We both turned around and booked it as fast as we possibly could, got back into the car, and sped off. Next thing I know, I'm standing up in Travis's kitchen, drinking a beer, and it's over 2 hours later. Everything between getting in the car and standing in the kitchen was a total blank. We both looked at each other and in unison said, "What the heck was that?" We got out Travis's camera and looked at the photos he took in the field. Nothing was out of the ordinary, and there were no clues. A few days later, I had my film developed. The 3 photos I had taken in the field were overexposed to the point of being black. I feel extremely silly when recounting this event, as it's essentially just a story about stumbling upon a vaguely sinister shack in the woods. But I know that the chill I feel down my spine whenever I remember it, and the occasional nightmares I have about finding that shack again, serve as a reminder that if either of us had taken a step further, something terrible would have happened. Scott and Cameron, submitted by user sockhermom. This story is in 2 parts, the one I remember and the one my family told me. This is the family story as I remember it. I was 7. My little sister and I left our house and went down to see the horses that the chief of police kept in a small patch of property down the road. That walk would have only taken 3 minutes at most, and when we got there, 2 of the kids from a family who lived across the road from the property, Scott and his big brother Cameron, were already there waiting for us. Scott said he could ride the chief's favorite horse, named Sunday, around the gated property. He'd done it 1,000,000 times. All of us, with the exception of Cameron, who was around 12, were too little to even attempt to climb over the fence to get to the horse. So I knew Scott must have been lying, and I told him to prove it. The next thing I remember is that I'm lying flat on the ground. My back hurts, I'm trying to catch my breath. My hands are gripping onto the matted grass around me. I'm on the horse side of the field. I must have climbed over the fence. I hear laughing and look over to see Scott and Cameron. I understand that I was the one who tried to ride Sunday, who was now running around in circles and neighing something fierce. I scrambled up and I hear my little sister crying. They've each got her by the arm and she's trying to get away. All the while, the Ford boys are laughing at me. I never liked the Ford boys. Our moms liked each other, but the boys could be mean. Right then, with their laughing that kept getting louder and louder, they seemed like the meanest people I've ever seen. Next, I'm on the side of the road. We're just standing there, my sister and I, in complete silence, until my father comes tearing down the road with his truck. He hops out, the motor still running, and throws us both into the front. He turns quickly around on the grass where the horses are calmly standing by and makes a short trip back to our house. My mom is beside herself. I feel her wet tears on my shirt as she kneels down and scoops both of us into her arms, screaming to never do that again. That they had been looking for us for so long. I've always known when to shut up, even as a little kid, so there was no way I was going to point out that we had only been gone a little while and it was all Scott and Cameron Ford's fault. When people joke about parenting in the 80s, that it was a wild time to be a kid and all that was asked of them was that they'd be home for dinner, I can never relate to that. My memories, particularly after the horse incident, is of my mom and dad always wanting to know where I was at all times. When I had my own kid, I had to make a concerted effort in not constantly worrying like my parents had. As I said, this was the story as I remembered it, not one I ever talked about with my parents or my sister. Just a strange instant in a kid's life where my parents got mad at me for disappearing and I tried to ride Sunday the horse. Now it's today, or more precisely, it's a couple of months ago. After living in another state for the bulk of my adulthood, the pandemic managed to shake our extended family up last year to the point that what made sense was for me, my husband, and our teenage son to move into my childhood home while my mom could move closer to other family members right in the village. My days are definitely different now. Taking care of my mom and my young nieces is not how I thought my life would be, but it works. It's weird coming back to the house you grew up in. Unthought memories come snapping back just by virtue of you sitting on a rock you liked to play on 40 years before. I'll turn around and think, that's where I spilled my juice when I was 10. It's not unpleasant, and eventually I get used to it. So, I like true crime podcasts. Did I mention that? I like some of them so much that if the hosts say they're guesting on another podcast, I'll download that episode for my next laundry binge. The premise of this new to me podcast is some comedians interview people around their paranormal experiences. Because it's supposed to be funny, there's a lot of giggling over seeing a ghost when completely trashed, etc. One of the guests tells this meandering story of walking home from school and discovering a fountain filled with blood, and little malevolent children trying to get her to stay, until her dad runs up to her screaming where had she been? She had been gone for hours. The hosts assure her that this is a common phenomenon and many stories have been written about this sort of experience of lost time and evil beings that sometimes take the shape of children. The one serious host, the one who identifies himself as a true believer, quickly tells her not to go looking for the fountain at all. The Fae, he explains, is what these creatures are, and if they think that they are being messed with or discovered, they will wreak vengeance. Of course, I thought. The most logical explanation is that, as a child, the guest either lost track of time or the parents overreacted, just like what happened to me. The memory snapback came rushing at me, so fast that I almost fell against the side of the dryer. Scott and Cameron weren't mean. Scott was a little younger than me, but we went to the same preschool and I called him my best friend. He was always at my house or me at his. I used to wish Cameron was my big brother. My mom has countless pictures of us doing all sorts of goofy things together. Chief Payne, the police chief, had an electric fence around the horses. My mom would walk us down to see the horses but never pet them because we'd get a jolt. There's no way I could have climbed that fence and tried to ride Sunday. We lived so close to the horses. Why didn't I hear my mom or dad calling for me? Why didn't they call Mrs. Ford to see if she saw me or my sister? It's because Scott and Cameron weren't there. They couldn't have been. By the time I was 7 and my little sister could walk on her own, they had moved out of the country. But that's my story. I walked down a road with my little sister to find 2 mean boys waiting for us. One said he could ride a horse, but somehow I was the one who got hurt. The boys kept laughing and laughing as if they'd never stop. My father and mother searched for us for hours when we were only minutes away. If you're wondering, I've passed that field 1,000 times since I've moved back. I've stood right where I was that day. Nothing has happened, but I don't stay for too long. The Whistler. Submitted by user bingbong1234. I've been waiting a long time to tell Reddit the full story of the Whistler. This story requires many details, but it is unexplainable, creepy, and 100% true. When I was about 8 years old, I was taking my dog for a walk through the neighborhood with my mom. It was maybe 11 p.m. We lived next to a swamp, wooded area on the edge of our neighborhood in Lansing, Michigan. I remember it being very silent and slightly windy. From down in the swamp, we heard somebody whistling at us. It sounded sort of like a bird, but each whistle was different enough for the lack of consistency made it human-like. The whistle sounded higher, then lower. I can't really describe it. My mom had a concerned, slightly terrified look on her face and grabbed my hand and said that we should go inside quickly. I didn't understand because I was too young, but seeing my mom freak out made me freak out too. After a while, though, I kind of forgot about it. 2 years later, I was taking my dog out again, late at night. There was a large bush that could easily obscure a person behind it, just next to the front door. As I finished the walk, the whistling noise started again. Same pitches, same inconsistent human-like tones. As soon as I heard it, a chill went down my spine, as I remembered exactly the feeling of seeing my mom, terrified, looking down into the swamp at something I couldn't see. I ran inside as fast as possible. Years went by, and I thought about it less and less. I told only a handful of people, and eventually it slipped from my mind. Fast forward to last summer. I'm 24, dating my girl Sarah. We moved out to South Dakota for work. For Independence Day, we decided to go to Pierre, South Dakota, and watch the fireworks along the bank of the Missouri River. There was a free camping spot behind a hospital where you could pitch your tent, hang out, and see the fireworks up the river. We were near the end of the campground, and there were very few people around us. As it was getting dark, the fireworks began. They were pretty far away, so the illumination they brought was very little. Thus, we had to sit right at the edge of the river to be able to see them. A huge thunderhead was moving in, and a storm was imminent, so the air seemed electric and the wind was picking up. The atmosphere was eerie, to say the least. The police boats herded all the other boats off of the river and had left our area to do that elsewhere. Most of the other campers walked up to the river to have a better view of the fireworks, but Sarah and I stayed back and were drinking PBR tall boys and kicking it. Suddenly, we heard the sound of a paddle methodically dipping into the water. We saw a figure steering a canoe about 20 meters offshore. Sarah decided to go get more beers from the car, leaving me alone to stare at this mystery person. And then, of course, they whistled at me. My entire body was frozen and covered in goosebumps. It was the exact same whistler from my childhood, more than a decade later. I looked at the figure, but it was much too dark to discern what it could be. They were wearing a hat, and when they were perpendicular to the shore from me, they stopped paddling, turned the canoe to face directly at me, and whistled right at me. I was so frightened I stood up and shouted at them, "Who are you?" They didn't say anything, just whistled a couple more times, turned the canoe 180 degrees, and paddled out of sight. When Sarah came back from getting beer, she was very confused as to why I was so freaked out. When I explained, she was freaked out a bit too. I was convinced we could both be murdered that night. How did this whistling person follow me after 14 years all the way to South Dakota? Was it a coincidence? Why was it the same whistling noise? Who was that person and where did they go? So many questions still unanswered. To this day, I'm more afraid of being outside in the dark where I might hear that whistling again. I'm open to any explanations. The Yellowstone Airbnb, submitted by user evalostagain. We rented an Airbnb in the wilds of Montana near Yellowstone, and we're in heaven. Long, gorgeous days of perfect weather, breathtaking twilights that lasted for hours. It didn't get dark until after 10 p.m. Our kids, my parents, my husband, and I were just over the moon about the beauty of this place. During the day, we hiked and explored Yellowstone, and in the late afternoon drove back to our cabin, cooked something simple, and enjoyed the outdoors from the comfort of the wraparound deck. Mountains all around, cool, crisp, clean air, golden rose sunsets that left us all curiously quiet with awe, just staring at the sky turning pink, purple, then deep sapphire blue as night quietly descended and the stars blazed bright. It was bliss. We had been there 3 days, all smiles and dazed with well-being, when one evening, as everyone sat around the dining table, a sudden hush descended upon all of us, and we all kind of looked at one another. It felt like someone else was in the room with us. The cabin was very open concept, so we could see the entire kitchen and living room from where we were sitting. All 7 of us were present and sitting around the table. I even counted us all out, and my 15-year-old son Alex said, "Mom, we're all here." I said, "I know, but..." "Yeah," my husband interrupted. "It's weird, right? Feels like someone else is here," my youngest, Bobby, said. My parents, very religious and superstitious, immediately quailed at this and began to clear up the dinner plates. The uneasy sensation was quickly dispelled, and we all filed outside to sit and gaze at the stars as we had done the past couple of days. The wind, as always, was blowing rather hard, and as on the other days, if you looked towards the south and the direction of Yellowstone, there were dark clouds gathered over the mountains, as if it would storm. We marveled at the sight and were very much engaged in betting whether it would rain this time or not. It hadn't thus far, when we heard the unmistakable sound of crunching gravel, as if someone else were walking up to the drive. It was dusk, but still light enough to see all the way down the driveway to the dirt road and beyond. There was no one there. We all stood and leaned over the deck railing to peer around. The sound was definitely upon us, and yet there was no one there. It was quite startling. Bobby, my youngest, quickly moved between my husband and I, and asked what that sound was. My heart was pounding with confusion, and I'm not going to lie, fear, as the sound became louder, just as if someone were approaching. I looked at my husband, whose jaw was set and eyes were narrowed with confusion, and at my parents, who looked bewildered and uncertain, and my sons, two of them openly curious and walking the length of the deck, looking for the source of the sound, and my youngest unsure and frightened. Then we all jumped at the sound of a door slamming forcefully from somewhere inside the house. The sound of footsteps had gone. The wind seemed to have stilled. We all wordlessly trooped inside, and my dad and husband went upstairs to investigate the sound of the slamming door. It was found to have been the door to the room where the boys were sleeping. That night, they slept in their sleeping bags in our room, just in case. But nothing else happened that night or the rest of the time we stayed there, a total of 5 days. But the lovely, carefree spell was broken. We had no idea what errant specter made its way through our space that evening, but it rattled us enough to have us looking over our shoulders for the rest of our stay. One other thing that I'm not sure is related or not. My husband and I woke one night and crept outside to see if we could find the Milky Way. As we marveled at the hazy azure columns studded with stars and wondered whether that was it or if we were imagining it, we very audibly heard a low shh. We didn't even look around, just went inside and locked up. Didn't mention it to each other until we were safely back home, and we still don't know what it was. The Man on the Trail, submitted by user Anacoenosis. My wife and I are avid backpackers, and we try to put at least one 20 to 30 mile weekend trip every month with our ultralight gear. We're fairly experienced at this point and have had numerous semi-dangerous encounters with wildlife and other wilderness hazards. We don't get shook easily. We're hiking a ridgeline trail in the late afternoon, planning to take a turn and head down into a drainage to camp near water before it gets dark. We've put down 10 plus miles that day and we're fairly beat, looking forward to setting up camp and getting dinner going. We see a guy coming up the trail towards us as we turn onto the drainage trail, wearing worn-out clothes. Up close, he's a white guy of kind of indeterminate age, somewhere between late 30s and late 40s. We acknowledge each other and strike up a little conversation on the trail. The first thing I notice is his accent. It's clearly American, but it's not the accent of the area we're in. And it's kind of, well, old-timey. There's kind of a music or lilt to it, but not a drawl. It's vaguely familiar, like something I've heard but can't quite recall. My wife is chatting with him while I puzzle his accent out, and then I notice he's covered in tattoos. Weird ones, too. I have ink, so I'm not one to judge someone for just having a tattoo, but I've never seen anything like these tattoos before. They're not standard badass tattoos or pictures. It's almost like writing, but not in any alphabet I've ever seen, and arranged in a way that makes me think there's also a picture if seen in full, like a magic eye game made up of some indecipherable script and inked onto a man's skin. I'm now getting an itchy, something is very wrong here feeling from this guy when I hear him say to my wife, "There's a great campsite down by the stream. Lots of campers have used it." I realize that we're an hour from sundown and at least 10 miles from anything, and this guy has nothing with him. Not a backpack, not a water bottle, no warm layers, just the clothes on his back, none of which have anything distinguishing about them. No logos or visible brands of any kind, and quite worn. He's about to get overnighted on the trail without any gear of any kind, and only the one campsite within 6 miles of where we're standing. I hear my wife say, "That's where we're going to camp. Thanks for the suggestion." And he smiles at us. His teeth are pointed, I assume filed, and curved inwards to the back of his mouth. I don't mean just his incisors. I mean his front teeth on top and bottom. I nod my agreement and say, "Enjoy the rest of your hike," and then we continue on. In another mile or two, we get down to the stream, and the campsite is lovely. Beautiful green grass, about 3 inches high, flat, dry, easy water access. However, there's no sign that anyone has camped there in a very long time. As we're looking it over, we find there's a ton of stakes in the ground. You'll usually find a stake or two at high-traffic campsites. Just people forgot them when they're packing up camp in the morning. We found more than 10 of wildly different ages and designs. Some old school and rusty, others new and shiny, but none of the grass is bent or broken, except where we've stepped in to check the site. Wordlessly, we both shouldered our packs and hiked another 6 or 7 miles to the next site. I'm neither spiritual nor superstitious, and I've never had any other experience that filled me with a sense of unexplained fear or impending doom than the way this one did. The National Park by Radis_Amicus. I'm from Finland, and that's also where these things I'm about to describe happened. This was some years ago, pre-smartphone GPS era. It was at the end of the summer, and myself and 2 friends were on a camping trip way up in the north in Lapland. The mosquito season was over, and the weather was cooling down in anticipation of the coming fall. The 3 of us had packed food and gear for a 10-day trek. The car we arrived in had been left at the parking lot of a visitor center. This happened within the premises of the Urho Kekkonen National Park, a 985 square mile stretch of wilderness near the Russian border. The terrain there varies greatly, from treeless and semi-mountainous to dense forests of spruce and pine and dwarf birch. There are a lot of swamps. Seeing reindeer is not uncommon, and some nights you may hear wolves in the distance. You can run into a bear or a wolverine in this place, but of course, normally they avoid people. We mostly camped in a tent, but some nights we used shelters and simple huts provided for travelers free of charge. The trip had lasted 5 days. We were at the furthest of any kind of civilization we were going to be on this particular outing. Truly in the middle of nowhere. There really is nothing there. There are no villages, towns, or industry. The place is a national park, after all. Seeing other hikers happened from time to time. You'd see some people in the distance maybe. Very rarely would you come face to face with anyone. So in the middle of our trip, we were camped in a small clearing. Woodland extending around us for a considerable distance in all directions. It was already dark. We had eaten our evening meal, and all 3 of us were jammed in our only tent and about to go to sleep in our sleeping bags. When we quieted down, we began to hear it. Talking. And the sound of machinery. Given our location, this was profoundly weird. We camped in a tent because there were no huts nearby. Maybe there was another camp somewhere near us? We couldn't quite make out what was being said, but it was a human voice, no doubt about that. But nothing really could explain the sound of heavy machinery. It sounded like an excavator or a tank. Something big, powerful, and really not too far away. Combined with the sound of talking, we thought construction yard. But at that time of night, in an unpopulated protective nature reserve, we got out of our tent. It was cold and pitch black. The campfire had some coals still glowing. My 2 buddies have always been a lot braver than me. The sound was clearly coming from the north, maybe half a kilometer away. We thought the construction might be going on behind a small hill some distance away. We could see no lights or anything. We still could not make out what was being said. The speaking-like voice was monotonous, and it was impossible to even say what language was being spoken. It still sounded like a person speaking, though. You may be aware of the sort of spooky phenomenon of hearing a human voice in static. Maybe you've used a blow dryer and been sure someone was talking to you, and then you turn it off and it was just something your brain tried to interpret from the steady hum. Maybe it was something like that. It's hard to explain. My 2 friends resolved to go find out what was going on. We put our warm clothes back on, donned boots, and I sat next to the dying fire, adding some more wood to it. I would stay at camp while my buddies left to check out this mystery construction yard in the middle of nowhere in the Lapland woods. So there I sat. The guys took out their maps, took a compass heading, and left, and I could hear them make their way through the forest, see the light from their flashlights. Then they were gone. The weird sounds continued unaltered. They were gone 15 minutes, then maybe 30, then the better part of an hour. It was odd. Judging by the volume of the sound, they should have reached it, checked it out, and been back already. I added more firewood and tried to make out what the person talking was saying, but it was too tinny and obscure. The guys had been away for over 2 hours. I figured they had stayed for coffee with the construction guys or something. Then the sound stopped. Just like that. It just ended. All at the same time. The engine sound and the voice both just quit. It was very silent. I waited for another 30 minutes, very worried now that something had happened, that maybe my friends were lost. Should I go and try to find them? I'd shouted their names several times and built the fire pretty big. I was scared when suddenly I saw the flashlights of my friends. Apparently, they were returning in a hurry. The guys got back to camp out of breath, and they told me the following. They had followed the sound beyond the small ridge in the distance. There was nothing there, and it seemed like they were not getting any closer to the source of the sounds. They had to stop every now and then, be quiet, and listen to it to be able to walk towards it. They walked and stopped like this for some time, then realized they were not getting any closer. The sounds did not change in volume at all. They decided to just go a bit further several times, when suddenly the sound just stopped, like someone pressed a button on a recording. They realized they had been going for a long time. They were in the middle of the dark woods, alone. They reversed the heading and started back at a brisk pace. Eventually, they saw my big fire from the top of the hill and found their way back. The weird thing is, we seem to think the sound stopped at different times. They had been gone for 2.5 hours in total. They said the sound stopped at around the 1 hour 15 mark after they left. They then started to head back immediately, return trip taking a bit longer even though they had a good pace. They apparently wandered around a bit. For me, the sound stopped at the 2-hour mark, just 30 minutes before they returned. We did not sleep that night. Nothing more happened on that trip, and we never found out what the weird construction yard-like sound was. When we returned to the park's visitor center some 5 days later, we asked around, but no one knew of any ongoing construction taking place in the whole national park area. And it's been bugging me ever since. The Dark Figure by MiaGothsEyebrows. I was in the forest that's part of a place called the Bridgewater Triangle, which is one of the most haunted areas in the United States. I was in a specific part of it called Profile Rock with 3 of my friends, and we were out there late. It was about 2:30 to 3 o'clock in the morning at the time. And we were on our way out, walking down this long, winding path to get back to our vehicle. Keep in mind, it was pitch black out, and we could only see from the moon shining through the trees. I don't know why I turned around. I didn't hear anything, and I didn't feel like anything was following us. But I turned around and looked back, and I saw something running at us about 100 feet away. What scared me wasn't that something was running at us. It was how it was running at us. You know how a zombie walks in a horror movie? Like it's dragging its leg, almost limping? That's how this thing was running at us. Like it broke its ankle or something. Initially, I thought it might be someone who got injured in the woods or something, until I saw this thing run past the moonlight. You know how a child draws a stick figure? That's exactly how this thing looked. It had no facial features and no face, just a completely blank face like a stick figure. And its body looked the same from what I could see, no definition or anything. I called out to my friend that was closest to me in a panic. He glanced in the direction I was looking, which was now all moonlit, and I could tell by his facial expression that I wasn't seeing things. We both took flight and started running. My other friends were up ahead, shot around, and asked us what was wrong, and I just replied, "Just run." I didn't look back once until we were right near our car, and it was gone like it was never there, even though, by then, it would have certainly been on top of us. I never know exactly what that was, but I did Google black men stick sightings and was horrified to find out that multiple people all over the world have seen something just like it. The Black Dog by MerryMinstrelsy. So this story is pretty simple, but it has always stuck with me. I grew up in the thick of southern Appalachia. I never gave much credence to the old folk tales I heard, and there were plenty. I met my boyfriend at the time when I was 16. We were high school sweethearts, and our story ended up being more like a true crime story, but that's not the focus of this story. Drugs had saturated our area. To party, we would ride down the mountain in his black Honda Civic, out the several miles of gravel road to the army camp at the river to a party. This particular night, there was going to be a meteor shower, and we wanted to see it. We crept through the darkness, down the winding mountain, across the bridge, down the access road towards the river. I had been there hundreds of times. The night felt unreasonably dark, heavy. There were no real residences on this road that led right to the waters of the freezing new river. I was not really a believer of anything supernatural. I am still really skeptical. We were rumbling down the road, and nothing seemed out of place until we saw it. In the dark road ahead, a black dog. Not a wolf, but easily just as big. A Great Dane if I've ever seen one, and I had not in real life. There were no residences, nothing around that would make you think that this expensive dog would be on this road. But there it stood in our headlights, and my boyfriend rolled to a stop as we looked at it. It kind of postured, I don't know. It was illuminated by our headlights, hackles up in a way I've never seen, and it just stood there. He beeped his horn and started creeping closer in the car. This dog did not care and was seemingly unconcerned. The closer we got, the more unreasonably unnerved I felt. It was just staring at us, like I could feel its gaze through the windshield, until it was practically against the bumper, and it was not going to move. We were at a standoff. So my boyfriend went around. He painstakingly cut his wheels, went off the gravel road to go around this unmoving hulk of a black dog. If it was in the middle of the road, we veered to the left of it so that it was on my side as we moved past. I remember how it stared at me. It was so tall that it was eye level with me in the passenger seat. I remember begging my boyfriend to hurry past because there was this awful feeling that it was aware of my discomfort. I'll never forget staring into its shock yellow eyes, right at eye level, as we veered around. It stared at me, unmoving, unbothered. Then we just rolled around it. Its head didn't move, didn't adjust his gaze as we continued. It disappeared into the inky darkness of the road, and I felt so cold and so upset. We got to the river, and I refused to leave the car. I had this unmistakable feeling that that thing was still out there, just beyond the trees, somewhere out in that pitch black. There was a meteor shower that night, and I barely watched it through the car's sunroof, because all I felt was that gaze, those horrible yellow eyes. It was still out there. I never liked going back to the river after that. I can't even describe the sense of dread, the feeling of a thing being so out of place. I never saw it again, though, but I'll never forget it. I never knew something that seemed so common, it was just a dog, could make me feel such deep dread, such palpable unease. Even now, thinking of those eyes makes my throat tighten. I feel like I saw the devil that night. The Cry in the Forest, submitted by user Kuwaitikitty. This happened 30 years ago. My dad and two friends were on a backpacking trip to a remote region of the Medicine Bow Wilderness. It was a quick, uneventful weekend trip, and the two friends actually left early Sunday morning to get home because they had to work the next day. It was about a 2-hour hike in from the canyon to the cars, and then a 4-hour drive to where they all lived in Colorado. My dad, who had the week off, stayed behind to pack up his tent and the rest of the camp. If you've ever been backpacking, you know the feeling of isolation when you're alone in the woods. Most of the time, this is a pleasant feeling, an escape from society and a return to nature. But if you're a backpacker, you also know the moments of panic where you think, what would I do if, insert terrifying scenario that only crosses your mind when you're hours away from civilization and help. So, here we find my dad. Several hours after his friends left, he was packing up the last of the gear, and something caught his attention. He could hear a sound over the roaring of the river. Focusing his attention away from packing to make out what he was hearing, he thought initially that the noise was an animal call, something shrill and frantic sounding, which made him snap to attention and abandon what he was doing to investigate. As he walked away from the river, he started to hear the call better. It wasn't an animal, he quickly realized. It was a voice. He stepped up onto the trail to hear better, trying to determine what the nature of the frantic cries were. It was then that he felt his stomach drop. The cry was a cry for help, but more than that, it sounded like it was coming from a child who seemed to be in quite a bit of distress. As he listened, he heard the child crying out clearly, "Daddy, Daddy!" and "Daddy, help me! Daddy, where are you?" Alarmed, he quickly started calling back to the child, a feeling of urgency settling in as he was instantly fearful for the child's safety. What was someone doing all the way out here, he wondered. He hadn't seen anyone passing by the trail all weekend. He yelled back at the top of his lungs, what you would expect. "Where are you? Are you okay? Tell me where you are." But when he would yell, the cries would abruptly stop for a few minutes, and no response came. He didn't know what to think or where to focus his search. He started up the trail towards the direction he thought the source of the voice was coming from. But when he did, he would hear the voice again. And this time, it would sound like it was behind him instead. This carried on for maybe about 20 minutes. The child crying out for help, my dad yelling back and walking up or down the trail in the direction he thought it was coming from, and then several minutes of silence. The way my dad describes it, the voice never seemed to get closer or further away, no matter which direction he walked. It just seemed to be somewhere nearby, but it was impossible to pinpoint where. By then, my dad was getting unnerved. He didn't know what to do or what to think, so he went back to camp and quickly packed up the remainder of his things. He admits he was getting spooked and just wanted to get the heck out of there. The calls didn't stop as he was packing, but he didn't know what to do at that point but to try and go get help. He made his way as fast as he could back up the trail into his car, leaving the crying child behind him. As soon as he got back to the car, he drove straight to the sheriff's office. When he asked if there was a missing hiker or child, they responded skeptically that they hadn't had any reports. When he told the story, they also didn't know what to think or what to tell him in comfort. They assured him they'd keep an ear open and send people down to the canyon. He stopped by a few days later on his way out of town to check again. Still nothing. No reports, no explanation. When I asked him about it today, I asked the logical questions. Was it an animal? He admits that would have made sense, but he insists, "Emily, it was a human. It was absolutely saying words that I could understand. And not only that, it was a child's voice. A small child, maybe 5 or 6. My dad already had 3 kids of his own at that point, so on this detail, he feels certain. If it was an animal, he can't think of an animal that could fool him like that. He's been camping and hunting since he was a kid, and he's been going to that campsite for the last 40 years, and has never heard anything like that again. Could it have actually been a missing hiker that was later found before it was reported? He thinks it's possible, but this trail is so isolated, to the point that you almost never see another hiker or group during your time down in the canyon. And he never heard anyone calling back or calling out. No adult voice who would have been looking for a child. For him, it was almost like he was hearing an echo, a reverberation of a voice that wasn't grounded to a place. 25 years later, my dad doesn't know what to think. Telling the story still makes him wildly uncomfortable, and he said it's probably the most frightened he's ever been while camping or backpacking. The Camp Counsellor, submitted by user Ohmygodwe'rehavinafire sale. My family has a camp in upstate New York that my dad and a bunch of his childhood friends saved from being demolished a few years after they graduated from grad school. It was originally an old school boys' camp, the wet, hot American summer type, except for all boys. So it worked out over the years that each one of my dad's friends started a family, and we all got a family cabin. We shared the dining hall, rec hall, boathouse, and lodge buildings. All the kids used to love when my dad's friend John, who had worked as a counselor at the original camp, would tell ghost stories around the campfire, because he always had the best stories. There was one, though, that always completely freaked us out. The story of Peter Black. Apparently, there had been a counselor at the camp named Peter Black. He used to be sort of strange. He had just graduated from high school and was sort of a loner. And on the second summer he was working at the camp, 3 of the counselors that worked with him, including my dad's friend John, filed a complaint with the owners and directors about his odd behavior. This behavior was never explicitly violent, but the counselors had seen him taking strange photos, lurking, writing long, detailed journals, and generally just being pretty off-putting to the kids. So, long story short, he was fired, and he was pretty ticked off about it. The next summer, he got into a car accident. He was drunk driving, and he passed away. He was all alone in his car, but apparently he was wearing his sort of trademark white raincoat and white rain hat when he died. He drove his car off a cliff in the Adirondacks, quite close to the camp. That's when everything started getting really weird. That summer at the camp, some of the kids started complaining about seeing a guy out on the lake in a boat wearing a white raincoat and holding a camera. Understandably, it started to really get to the counselors that got him fired, and eventually, all of them except John quit. That fall, one of the counselors got into a car accident with his girlfriend and died. Another one almost drowned the next spring in a boating accident. It was apparently really, really frightening for the counselors, but since the car accident wasn't suspicious, it was all ruled accidental and forgotten. Soon after that, the camp was closed. Now, I'm sure this can all be chalked up to the power of suggestion and maybe fear, but on one rainy day at camp, years after the Peter Black story had last been told at a campfire, I was sitting in my dad's friend Carl's cabin with his son Ian. We were about 15 or 16, and we're messing around with Ian's binoculars, looking out the back window. That's when we saw it. A man in a white raincoat and white rain hat in a boat on the lake, holding a camera. My whole body got chills as Ian and I both dropped the binoculars and ran into the other room. I have seriously never been so terrified. It felt like someone had run an ice cube down my spine. After a few minutes of hyperventilating, we convinced ourselves that we had imagined it, and we went back to the window and looked in the binoculars again. The guy was still there. Except this time, he looked about a mile closer to us than he had before. Just sitting there, staring straight ahead, looking into a camera. And then, I swear on everything in my life, he put the camera down and waved. We both screamed and ran to the kitchen to find our parents. When we got to the kitchen, John was there too. And as my mom told us we were being ridiculous, John just looked at me with what I can describe as deadened, horrified look in his eyes. I never saw the man in the boat again, but I believe it was something. Either way, I don't mess around on rainy days at camp anymore. The Train Tracks. Submitted by author Chirp. It was near the end of high school, 2006-ish, fall in northern Wisconsin. Perfect stomping around town weather. One Friday after school, I was over at my on and off high school boyfriend, Jay's house, playing video games. Around 7 p.m., we typically would meet up with our whole crew at a local restaurant, but we still had several hours to kill. We were getting bored and it was so lovely out, so Jay suggested we go walk the train tracks on the west side of town. The town has been built up so much since then, but back then there was only a Fleet Farm and a small burger joint nearby the tracks, and that was about it. Miles of woods on either side surrounded the tracks. As it was perfect weather, and that doesn't last long in Wisconsin, I agree, and we jumped in his car and drove across town. We parked his car to the side of a burger joint. At this point, it's late afternoon, about dusk. Sun was ready to set. We hop out of the car, walk about a block where the train tracks cross the street, take a right down the tracks through the woods. This area didn't get as many trains going through as a different set of tracks in town, and there was plenty of space to the left and right of the tracks into the woods if a train did approach. It seemed safe. You could see maybe a mile in each direction if a train was coming, and to either side, there was just tall pines. We're walking down, balancing on the tracks, talking, jumping over stuff, whatever, for maybe about 5-10 minutes. Up ahead, we could see a few boxcars off to the side of the tracks. As we approached them, we could see there were 2 boxcars attached to each other, maybe another 10-20 feet, and then a single boxcar behind them. I got the heebie-jeebies as we approached the boxcars, but they were both shut, so we just peeked around them, climbed up, and they were less menacing. It was pretty cool. We kept walking. The sun was now down, and it's twilight. It was very quiet, and we were both looking down as we walked past the boxcars, balancing and such. We get past them, maybe another length of a boxcar, when I have the sense to look up. And that's when I see it. I stopped short, and I swear the hair on my arms stood up, and I suddenly felt like a prey animal that had been spotted. Jay, what's that up there? Is there someone on the tracks? He stopped and looked up. What looks like maybe half a mile to a mile down the tracks, standing directly in the middle, is the shape of a person, or what I think is a person. But for how far away it is, it's unnaturally tall. Standing stiff and still, arms at sides with what looks like the shape of a bowler hat. I can still picture it. Now, Jay doesn't mess around with ghost stories and alien tales. He's a non-believer. But he sees it too. We need to go, is all he says. He grabs my hand and spins me back to the direction we came from. We're walking very briskly. But if you have ever been on train tracks, you know it's a small rocks and pebbles all over the place, so it's a little rough. About a minute passes, my heart is pounding, and I look back over my shoulders. This person, who was originally about a mile away, is so much closer. It's like he suddenly jumped half the distance between where he originally was and where we are. But still, same sickeningly tall, featureless shadow, hat, standing still, arms to his side, in the middle of the tracks. I scream, making him whip his head around. I've never seen this guy scared. He grabbed my hand tighter and breaks off into a sprint. Jay was about 6 feet tall and I'm 5'4", so his stride was a bit longer than mine. A couple of years prior, I had recovered from a fractured knee and femur, and it's common knowledge that I could not run. If you ever seen the cartoons where someone's running and the other person's kind of flapping behind the runner, held by the hand, that's what it felt like. He took off. My legs moved, but my toes barely skimmed the tracks. We ran past the boxcars off to the side, and we're about to get past the 2 that were hooked together. I steal one more frantic look over my shoulders as we're plowing ahead, and there he is, 1 boxcar away. At this proximity, it was the same weird proportions, like a dark, opaque shadow. I swear my eyes bugged out of my head and my body and adrenaline said, "Get out of there." I forced my legs down and pushed my own damn self into a run. We plowed forward, hooked back onto the street, and frantically fumbled our way back into his car, slamming and locking the doors behind us. I remember both of us sitting there, panting, staring forward for a good minute or 2, until snapping back. The sun went down, nothing could be seen towards the tracks. We went to our hangout with the crew of 7, chomping at the bit to tell everyone what happened. No one believed us or cared. I told my dad later, and he says that so many people died on that railroad that it was probably a ghost. Fast forward to maybe 2011. I'm in college, Jay and I broke up and don't keep in touch. I get a text from him out of the blue, a link to a Slender Man game. I remember sitting in my dorm with a chill as I watched the preview and felt sick to my stomach. How he only moves towards you when you aren't looking and is frozen staring at you when you look back. I read the Wikipedia page and the creepypasta and all of that. I know all that stuff is made up, but the similarity to what we experience still freaks me out. And that's all we have for tonight's episode. I hope these stories scratched your spooky itch, made your Halloween a little bit more special and terrifying. What about you? Have you ever had an eerie encounter in the great outdoors? Or maybe your own unsettling experience with the Fae? If so, please let me know. You can comment on the YouTube channel or send me an email at chillersandthrillers@gmail.com. As always, thank you so much for listening and supporting the podcast. It means so much to me to see listeners from all over the world enjoying my little corner of creepiness. Please make sure you share the podcast with your paranormally inclined friends and family. Check out the YouTube channel and leave a comment letting me know you came from the podcast as well. I'll see you next time with more chilling tales of the strange and unexplained.